What if the person you trusted most wasn't just watching a tragedy unfold, but quietly steering it? That question sits at the center of this story. And once you hear what was allegedly whispered on a deathbed, words too heavy to carry into the light until it was almost too late, you'll understand why nothing about this case feels settled. Not the arrests, not the timelines, not the silence that followed. Because this isn't just about a brutal double homicide in a quiet Brentwood mansion. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It's about family gravity, about influence, about how a single push, delivered at the right moment, can tip someone over an edge they were already circling. Picture the scene for a moment. A $13.5 million estate, tall hedges, security cameras, the kind of place where nothing bad is supposed to happen, at least, nothing that can't be smoothed over quietly. And yet, inside those walls, 2 lives ended violently. Multiple sharp force injuries. A Sunday night that would fracture a family forever. The immediate story felt almost too neat. The son lived in the guest house. The son was arrested. The son was charged. Case closed, right? But if it were that simple, why are there so many unanswered questions still hanging in the air? Why did the timeline keep shifting in the early hours? Why did one family member reportedly warn police about a dangerous relative without naming names? And why, years later, would a confession emerge not from an interrogation room, but from a deathbed? Here's where things get uncomfortable. Because the confession wasn't framed as, "I did it." It was framed as something far colder. I was the one who pushed him, not with a weapon, not with a threat, but with words, with pressure, with emotional leverage applied slowly, deliberately, over time. Ask yourself this. How many crimes are committed not by monsters, but by people who were nudged, convinced, worn down? In psychology, there's a term for it: moral disengagement. The moment someone stops seeing their actions as their own. The moment responsibility gets outsourced to someone else's voice echoing in their head. And according to this fictionalized confession, that voice didn't come from outside the family. It came from inside, from someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure. Someone who understood vulnerabilities, resentments, old wounds that never healed. Someone who didn't need to raise their voice, because they knew silence could do more damage. Let's be clear, this story does not move in straight lines. There are contradictions layered on top of contradictions. Public statements that don't quite align with private recollections. Emotional reactions that feel slightly out of sync with the moment. And then there's the timing of the confession itself. Why wait until the very end? Why carry that weight until breathing itself became difficult? Was it guilt? Was it fear? Or was it control, held until the final second? Here's another question that doesn't get asked enough. If someone believes they pushed another person to commit an act, do they see themselves as guilty? Or as powerful? Because power doesn't always look like dominance. Sometimes it looks like guidance. Like concern. Like saying, "I'm just telling you the truth." Throughout this story, you'll hear about influence masquerading as care, about loyalty twisted into obligation, about a family dynamic where love and manipulation became indistinguishable. And you'll notice something else. Everyone remembers the night of the crime, but very few people talk about the months before it. That's where the real story hides. The arguments that never made headlines. The private conversations that left no recordings. The emotional debts that kept piling up quietly. This fictional dramatized account doesn't ask you to decide guilt in a legal sense. It asks you something harder. Who really moves the pieces when everything falls apart? Was the arrested son acting alone, or was he acting under the long shadow of someone else's expectations? Was the confession an act of honesty, or an attempt to rewrite history one last time? And perhaps most chilling of all, if the push hadn't happened, would the crime still have occurred? As we move forward, every chapter will peel back another layer, not just of what happened, but of why it happened. You'll hear about subtle escalations, emotional traps, and the kind of influence that leaves no fingerprints. But before we go any further, sit with this. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one holding the knife. It's the one who convinced someone else they had no choice. And when we return, we'll step back to the very beginning. Before the arrests, before the headlines, to examine the family dynamics that made this tragedy not just possible, but, in hindsight, terrifyingly predictable. Before the sirens, before the headlines, Before a family name became synonymous with something no publicist could clean up, ask yourself this first. How many disasters begin loudly? Almost none. They begin quietly, with tension that's explained away, with small fractures everyone pretends not to see. And in this story, those fractures were there long before anyone bled. Go back months before that Sunday night. The house was still standing. The guest house lights still flicked on and off at odd hours. Family dinners still happened, or at least, attempts at them did. On the surface, it looked like a family navigating stress. Nothing unusual. Successful parents. Adult children finding their footing. Occasional disagreements. The kind of thing people shrug off with phrases like, every family has problems. But here's the thing. Not every family lives inside a pressure cooker. Not every conversation carries an unspoken scoreboard. Not every interaction feels like a test you're constantly failing. According to this fictionalized reconstruction, the emotional weather inside that family had been changing for a long time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day, everyone was soaked and pretending it wasn't raining. Let's talk about the son for a moment. Not the headline version. Not the mugshot version. The version who lived in the guest house, close enough to be watched, far enough to feel exiled. What does it do to a person to live that way? Close, but not included. Present, but never quite trusted. Dependent, yet resented for that dependency. You start internalizing contradictions. You're told you're loved, but reminded you're a problem. You're encouraged, but never fully supported. You're forgiven, but never allowed to forget. That kind of environment doesn't explode all at once. It erodes. And erosion is dangerous because it feels natural, gradual, almost reasonable. Now add another layer. An adoptive sibling dynamic that everyone tiptoed around but never truly addressed. Because unspoken roles form quickly in families like this. The responsible one, the difficult one, the fixer, the disappointment. And once those labels stick, every action gets filtered through them. If the difficult one raises a concern, it's drama. If the responsible one applies pressure, it's guidance. Do you see how power sneaks in? In this story, influence didn't come from shouting matches or ultimatums. It came from repetition, from phrases dropped casually but often. You're embarrassing the family. You're making things harder for everyone. Do you know how much stress you're causing? At first, they sound like observations. Then they become accusations. Eventually, they become truths the listener accepts without questioning. And here's where the confession later becomes so chilling. Because the person who would eventually say, I pushed him, didn't describe a single moment. They described a process. Weeks of conversations. Late-night talks framed as concern. Reminders of debts, emotional and financial. Comparisons to siblings who were handling life better. Think about that for a second. What's more powerful? Telling someone to do something once, or convincing them that they already should want to? By the time anyone raised their voice, the groundwork was already laid. The son wasn't being commanded. He was being convinced that he was failing everyone, that he was the problem, that fixing things required sacrifice, that doing nothing would make him selfish. And the more he tried to pull away, the more pressure closed in. Family pressure has a unique gravity. You can ignore strangers. You can quit jobs. You can walk away from friends. But family lives in your head, even when they're silent, especially when they're silent. According to this dramatized account, there were moments when he tried to create distance, tried to establish boundaries, tried to assert independence. Each time, the response was subtle but effective. Coldness, disappointment, withdrawn affection, no shouting, no scenes, just the sense that love was conditional. And conditional love is one of the most powerful motivators there is. Now let's talk about the parents. Because they weren't villains in this story. They were tired, aging, stressed, caught between wanting peace and wanting control. They wanted the problem solved, without acknowledging how deep it ran. So they did what many parents do. They leaned on the stronger child, the one who could talk sense into him, the one who knew how to handle him, the one who could keep things from blowing up. And that's where the line blurred. Because suddenly, influence wasn't just personal. It was endorsed. Pressure wasn't just sibling to sibling. It was carrying parental weight. Every time someone said, you should talk to him, it reinforced authority. Every time they said, he listens to you, it transferred responsibility. And responsibility, when mixed with resentment, can turn toxic fast. Behind closed doors, conversations grew heavier. What if you're the only one who can fix this? What if doing nothing makes you complicit? What if one decisive act could end all this chaos? Notice how language shifts from concern to obligation to inevitability. And here's the contradiction that sits at the center of everything. Publicly, the family emphasized unity. Privately, trust was eroding. Publicly, they spoke about love. Privately, they spoke about liability. Those two realities can't coexist forever. Something has to give. In this story, what gave wasn't just a relationship. It was a person's sense of self. By the time the final week arrived, the son wasn't asking, "Should I do this?" He was asking, "How do I make this stop?" And that question is dangerous. Because when someone reaches that point, they're no longer weighing morality. They're weighing relief. As we move closer to the night itself, pay attention to this. Nobody in this story thought they were creating a monster. They thought they were managing a problem. They thought they were preventing embarrassment, preventing chaos, preventing shame. But pressure doesn't disappear. It transfers. And when it finally releases, it rarely does so cleanly. Next, we're going to step into the final days. The conversations that felt routine at the time, but read like warnings in hindsight. Because once you see how the last domino was positioned, you start to understand why the person on that deathbed didn't say, "I helped." They said, "I pushed." And what came next would make even that admission feel incomplete. Have you ever looked back at an ordinary conversation and thought, "Why didn't I hear the warning in that?" That's the cruel trick of hindsight. Nothing announces itself as the final straw while it's happening. In the days leading up to that Sunday night, life didn't feel cinematic. No dramatic confrontations. No slammed doors. No last words that sounded like last words. Just routines. Just tension humming under the surface. Just people moving around each other carefully, like furniture you've learned not to bump into. But beneath that calm, something was accelerating. The son started sleeping less. Not in the dramatic way people expect. Pacing, muttering, spiraling visibly. It was quieter than that. Lights on at odd hours. Long stretches staring at nothing. Meals skipped not out of rebellion, but disinterest. When someone asked if he was okay, the answer was automatic. "I'm fine." And everyone accepted it because accepting it was easier than digging deeper. Now think about this. How often do people say, "I'm fine," when they mean, "I don't know how to fix this"? Those final days were filled with conversations that sounded supportive on the surface. "We just want what's best for you. This can't continue forever. Something has to change." Reasonable sentences. Calm tones. But tone isn't what determines impact. Context does. When someone already feels like a burden, being told something has to change doesn't sound like encouragement. It sounds like a deadline. And deadlines create urgency. Urgency narrows options. By midweek, the pressure wasn't coming from one direction anymore. It was layered. Parents expressing exhaustion. Siblings expressing frustration. Unspoken comparisons hanging in the air. Why can't you just be normal? Why can't you just move on? Why are you making this so hard? No one said those exact words. They didn't need to. He could hear them anyway. According to this fictionalized account, one particular conversation stands out. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was devastating because it was calm. A talk framed as honesty. "This can't go on. You're hurting them. You're hurting yourself." And then came the line that changes everything. "If you really cared, you'd do something. Do something. Not leave. Not get help. Not set boundaries. Just do something." And here's where influence becomes invisible. Because do something lets the listener fill in the blank. It allows responsibility to shift without explicit instruction. If the outcome is good, everyone supported change. If the outcome is bad, no one told him to do that. That ambiguity is powerful and dangerous. Over the next 2 days, he withdrew further. Phone calls unanswered. Messages read but not replied to. Silence that was interpreted differently by everyone involved. To some, it looked like sulking. To others, avoidance. But internally, it looked like decision-making. People imagine decisions happen in dramatic moments. They don't. They happen in quiet loops. What if I don't? What if I do? What if this really is the only way? Each loop tightens the spiral. And once someone convinces themselves there's only one solution, persuasion stops being necessary. Now let's talk about the person who would later confess. Because this is where the story takes its darkest turn. In these final days, their role wasn't to escalate. It was to steady. to normalize the idea that something drastic might be necessary, to frame it not as violence, but as inevitability. Sometimes things reach a breaking point. Sometimes people force your hand. Sometimes there are no good options. Notice what's missing from those statements. Personal responsibility. They don't say, you should do this. They say, this is what happens. That distinction matters, because it allows the speaker to feel detached while still shaping the outcome. By Friday, the atmosphere in the house was strained but oddly quiet. Like everyone was waiting. For what? No one could articulate. But everyone felt it. The son reportedly visited the main house that evening. Nothing explosive happened. That's the part that confuses people later. No argument. No scene. Just a brief interaction that left everyone unsettled. He didn't stay long. Left with the same closed expression he arrived with. And afterward, one family member reportedly said something chilling in hindsight. I don't like that look. What look? The look of someone who's already decided. Saturday passed slowly. Too slowly. Time stretched in a way that made everything feel suspended. People went about their routines, but attention drifted. Meals half-eaten. Television on, but not watched. And underneath it all, the unspoken question lingered. Is this going to end? Or get worse? Sunday arrived without fanfare. No sense of finality. Just another day. Until it wasn't. The hours leading up to the night itself are fragmented in this account. Partly because memories distort under trauma. Partly because no one wants to admit how ordinary everything felt. One last conversation, one last chance to interrupt the chain. And yet, nothing changed. Because by that point, the push had already happened. Not physically. Psychologically. The idea had been planted. Watered. Left to grow on its own. When the call finally came. When reality shattered the illusion that this was just another family crisis. Shock rippled outward in predictable ways. Disbelief. Denial. Grief. But beneath it all, there was something else. Recognition. The sickening awareness that this didn't come out of nowhere. That the warning signs weren't invisible. They were just inconvenient. As investigators began piecing together timelines and movements, the family began doing something else. Rewriting memory. Who said what? When they last spoke. How serious things really were. Because once tragedy becomes real, everyone wants to locate themselves on the right side of history. But the confession that would come later suggests something far more unsettling. That at least one person knew, before the night, that they were playing with fire, and chose to keep going anyway. Next, we're going to step inside the immediate aftermath. The shock. The statements. The subtle shifts in tone that reveal more than words ever could. Because sometimes, the most telling clues don't appear at the scene of the crime. They appear in how people react when they think the story is already finished. And what came next would raise a question no one was prepared to answer. Was the confession an act of remorse? Or an attempt to control the narrative one final time? What happens when the story seems finished, but your gut tells you it isn't? That's where this chapter begins. Because the arrest should have been the end. Sirens. Handcuffs. Charges announced with clinical precision. 2 counts. First degree. Case framed. For the outside world, the narrative snapped into place with unsettling speed. The son lived on the property. The violence occurred inside the main house. The proximity alone felt like an answer. But for the people inside that family, certainty didn't bring relief. It brought panic. The hours after the arrest blurred together in a way trauma often does. Phones rang nonstop. Voices overlapped. No one finished a sentence. Everyone kept repeating the same phrases, as if saying them enough times would make them true. We had no idea. This is unbelievable. He would never. Notice the structure of those statements. They weren't questions. They were defenses. Because once an arrest is made, every past interaction gets re-examined. Every text message becomes evidence. Every argument becomes motive. And suddenly, silence isn't neutral anymore. It's suspicious. In the immediate aftermath, the family closed ranks publicly. Statements emphasized shock, grief, unimaginable loss. And on the surface, they were sincere. But privately, something else was happening. Conversations weren't about mourning. They were about exposure. Who knew what? Who said what to whom? What could be misinterpreted? Because once law enforcement steps in, intent becomes everything. And intent doesn't just live in actions. It lives in words. Especially not the kind that asks uncomfortable questions. Like, did we push too hard? Did we miss something obvious? Did anyone make things worse? Those questions threatened the stability of the story. And stability mattered, because the public narrative had already formed. Sun snaps. Tragedy occurs. Justice proceeds. Anything that complicated that picture was dangerous. Now let's talk about the son for a moment. Because after the arrest, his behavior reportedly shifted. Not in the way people expect. There were no dramatic breakdowns. No grand proclamations of innocence or guilt. Just confusion. He asked the same questions repeatedly. How did it get here? Why didn't anyone stop me? Why didn't someone say something sooner? Those aren't the questions of a mastermind. They're the questions of someone who feels acted upon. And that terrified the people who heard them. Because if he believed he was pushed, what did that say about everyone else? Visits became strained. Conversations ended abruptly. Legal counsel advised minimal contact. And yet, according to this dramatized account, one person maintained access longer than the others. Framed as support. Framed as obligation. But in hindsight, it reads differently. Because those conversations weren't about comfort. They were about alignment. Stick to the facts. Don't speculate. Let the lawyers handle it. On the surface, that's good advice. But beneath it, something else was happening. A shared version of events was being reinforced. And the more it was repeated, the more real it became. Even to the people repeating it. This is how collective narratives form. Not through conspiracy. Through convenience. Now let's shift to law enforcement's perspective. Investigators are trained to look for inconsistencies. And families under stress produce them naturally. But what stood out in this case, according to our fictional reconstruction, wasn't chaos. It was coordination. Statements that sounded too similar. Phrases repeated verbatim by different people. Emotional reactions that felt calibrated. That doesn't mean guilt, but it does mean awareness. And awareness invites scrutiny. As days turned into weeks, pressure mounted. Media attention intensified. Public sympathy fractured. Online speculation exploded. Every leaked detail became a new battlefield. And within that noise, something unexpected happened. A quiet withdrawal. The person who had been most vocal early on began stepping back. Less availability. Fewer statements. A noticeable shift from engagement to distance. At the time, it was explained as grief. But later, when the confession surfaced, that withdrawal took on a different meaning. It looked like preparation. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Confessions don't appear out of nowhere. They gestate. They form when maintaining the lie becomes harder than telling the truth. Or when control over the narrative starts slipping. In this story, control was everything. Control over how the son was perceived. Control over how the family was perceived. Control over who bore responsibility and who did not. But control is fragile. And cracks began forming in unexpected places. A comment overheard. A text message misinterpreted. A private remark shared with the wrong person. Small things. But small things accumulate. And slowly, the person who had once been orchestrating calm started showing signs of strain. Sleeplessness. Irritability. Moments of uncharacteristic honesty that were quickly walked back. It wasn't dramatic. It was human. The weight of influence pressed inward. Because influencing someone to act is one thing. Living with the outcome is another. As the legal process dragged on, the family's internal dynamics shifted again. Distance replaced coordination. Suspicion replaced unity. People started asking themselves questions they'd avoided. Did you notice how they talked to him? Did you ever feel like they were pushing too hard? Did anything they said feel off? Those questions didn't have answers yet. But they had momentum. And momentum is dangerous when it starts rolling backward. As we move into the next chapter, we're going to explore the moment when control began to fail completely. When illness entered the picture. When time became limited. When the carefully constructed narrative faced its first true threat. Because when someone knows their end is approaching, priorities change. And the question stops being, how do I protect myself? It becomes, what do I need to say before it's too late? And when that moment came, the truth didn't arrive gently. There's a moment in every long tragedy when time stops being abstract. When someday turns into soon. When consequences stop feeling theoretical and start pressing against the chest. That moment didn't arrive with a diagnosis announced dramatically in a hallway. It arrived quietly. In the way conversations shortened. In the way appointments multiplied. In the way certain topics were suddenly avoided altogether. Because illness has a way of rearranging priorities without asking permission. At first, the signs were easy to rationalize. Fatigue blamed on stress. Weight loss blamed on grief. Missed calls blamed on overwhelm. Everyone in the family was under strain. No one wanted to be the person who said, "Something feels wrong." But something was wrong. And deep down, more than one person knew it. As weeks passed, the person who would later confess began changing in subtle ways. They stopped correcting others mid-sentence, stopped managing conversations, stopped inserting themselves as the stabilizer. Instead, they listened, really listened. And listening, in this case, wasn't comforting. It was dangerous, because the more they listened, the more they heard echoes of their own words coming back at them. Not accusations, reflections. I didn't feel like I had a choice. I thought it would finally stop. I thought it was what everyone wanted. Those phrases weren't delivered angrily. They were delivered flatly, like conclusions already reached. And every time the son said something like that, the weight of influence became harder to ignore. Imagine hearing your own logic repeated back to you after it's been acted on. There's no undoing that. Only accounting. The illness progressed in uneven steps. Good days that offered false reassurance. Bad days that left everyone shaken. Doctors spoke in careful language. "We're monitoring. We're adjusting. We'll know more soon." But everyone understood what wasn't being said. Time was shrinking. And with shrinking time comes urgency. The kind that strips away strategy. The kind that makes people honest or reckless. During one particularly difficult week, a conversation took place that would later be remembered as a turning point. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't denied. The son, exhausted and raw, asked a question that hung in the air far longer than anyone expected. "Did you mean it when you said I had to do something?" Silence followed. Not the thoughtful kind, the loaded kind. And in that silence, something shifted. Because silence can be agreement. It can be confirmation. It can be the moment someone realizes they crossed a line they can't step back over. From that point on, interactions became strained. The person who once framed everything as guidance now avoided direct statements altogether. They spoke in fragments, in half-answers, in careful redirections, as if precision itself had become dangerous. And in a way it had. Because precision invites responsibility. As health declined, the family reorganized around care. Schedules adjusted, roles reassigned. But beneath the logistics, another process was unfolding. Preparation. Not for death, for truth. The person at the center of the eventual confession began revisiting memories obsessively. Old conversations replayed in the mind. Moments re-examined with new clarity. What felt like concern then now felt like pressure. What felt like support now felt like steering. And here's the cruel part. At the time, it all made sense. They believed they were preventing something worse. Believed they were protecting the family. Believed they were doing what no one else had the strength to do. But beliefs don't absolve outcomes. They coexist with them. As physical strength faded, emotional defenses weakened. There's a reason deathbed confessions happen. It's not because people suddenly grow brave. It's because maintaining control becomes exhausting. And exhaustion tells the truth. Late one night, during a moment of rare clarity, the person reportedly said something that stunned the listener. "I don't know how to live with this." Not what happened. This. The implication was clear. The burden wasn't the crime. It was the influence. Because influence doesn't end when actions are taken. It lingers. It follows. It asks to be acknowledged. From that night on, there was a shift in tone. Conversations moved away from logistics and toward meaning. What do you think matters in the end? What would you change? What do you regret? Regret. That word appeared more frequently. Not loudly. Tentatively. As if testing whether it was safe to say. And here's where the family dynamic fractured in a new way. Some members encouraged reflection. Others shut it down immediately. That's not helpful. Focus on rest. You don't need to carry everything. But the weight was already there. And trying to lift it only made it heavier. As the end drew closer, the person who would confess became increasingly selective about who they spoke to. Some visits shortened. Others extended unexpectedly. One individual, in particular, became a confidant. Not because they were trusted more, but because they asked fewer questions. They listened without interrupting. And listening creates space. Space invites honesty. The confession didn't come all at once. It came in fragments. A sentence here. A clarification there. Until finally, the core truth surfaced. I didn't stop him. I didn't pull him back. I pushed him forward. Those words weren't shouted. They were delivered with the flatness of someone stating a fact they've accepted. And the listener froze. Because this wasn't an emotional outburst. It was an admission. Of influence. Of responsibility. Of moral culpability, if not legal. The listener asked the obvious question. Why are you telling me this now? The answer was simple. Because I don't have much time left. And because stories harden when the truth doesn't interrupt them. That's when the stakes change completely. Because once a confession exists, even privately, it has momentum. It wants to move. It wants to be heard. And suddenly, the person holding that confession faced a choice. Protect the dying, or honor the truth. And that choice would fracture the family more deeply than the crime itself. Next, we're going to explore what happens when a confession refuses to stay contained. When whispers turn into decisions. When silence becomes complicity. Because the moment those words were spoken, the story stopped belonging to one person. And what came next would force everyone involved to confront a question they'd avoided from the beginning. Was the crime an isolated act, or the final consequence of something much larger? Some truths are spoken with the expectation that they'll die where they're said. This was one of them. The confession didn't come with a request. No instructions. No demand for forgiveness. It came as a release. A weight set down quietly, almost gently, as if the speaker believed that once the words were out, their responsibility would dissolve into the air. But words don't work like that. Once spoken, they attach themselves to listeners. They follow them home. They replay at night. They reshape memory. And the person who heard that confession understood immediately that nothing would ever be the same again. Because now, they knew something no one else did. And knowledge is never neutral. In the days that followed, the listener struggled with a question that had no clean answer. What do you do with a truth that arrived too late to stop anything, but too heavy to ignore? Every option felt wrong. If they stayed silent, they became a guardian of a lie. If they spoke up, they became an accomplice to pain. And hovering over everything was the ticking clock. Time was no longer an abstract concept. It was measured in breaths. The person who confessed was fading quickly now. Physical weakness replaced emotional restraint. Moments of clarity alternated with confusion, but the admission never wavered. Each time the listener gently revisited it, hoping, maybe, that it had been exaggerated or misremembered, the response was consistent. I know what I said. I know what I did. That certainty was terrifying, because it meant this wasn't a slip. It was a reckoning. As the family gathered more frequently, the listener noticed changes in how the confessor behaved around others. They avoided eye contact during certain conversations, flinched at casual remarks about responsibility or blame, went quiet when the son's name was mentioned. Guilt has a way of leaking through behavior, no matter how carefully someone tries to contain it. And the listener wasn't the only one who noticed. Another family member commented quietly one evening. They seem different. Different how? I don't know. Like they're carrying something. That comment landed harder than it should have. Because now the listener wasn't just holding a secret. They were holding a fracture point. The family's unity had always been fragile, more performance than reality. And this truth threatened to shatter it completely. The listener began testing the edges. Asking indirect questions. Raising hypothetical scenarios. What if someone pushed too hard? What if influence mattered more than action? The reactions were telling. Some people shut down immediately. Others grew defensive. One response stood out. That's not how things work. Everyone makes their own choices. It was said too quickly, too rehearsed, as if it had been practiced. And that's when the listener realized something chilling. This confession might not have been as isolated as it felt. Others may not have known the words, but they knew the dynamic. They knew how pressure had been applied. They knew how responsibility had been framed. They just didn't want to name it. Naming it would implicate everyone, not legally, but morally. And moral implication is harder to escape. As the confessor's condition worsened, conversations turned increasingly existential. Do you think people are defined by their worst mistake? Do you think intention matters more than outcome? Those weren't casual musings. They were tests. The listener answered carefully. Sometimes intention explains. It doesn't excuse. The response was immediate. I know. 2 words. Heavy with meaning. That night, the listener barely slept. They replayed the confession again and again. The tone, the phrasing, the absence of self-pity. This wasn't someone trying to absolve themselves. This was someone acknowledging power they wished they'd never had. And power, once acknowledged, demands consequence. The next morning, a decision began to form. Not a plan, an obligation. Because silence, at this point, wasn't neutral. It was protection. Protection of the confessor's legacy. Protection of the family's public image. Protection of a narrative that placed all responsibility on one person. But protection has a cost, and that cost would be paid by the truth. The listener began documenting, not recording conversations, that felt invasive, but writing, dates, statements, observations. Not to build a case, to anchor memory, because memory blurs under pressure. And if this ever surfaced, it needed to be clear, precise, undeniable. As days passed, the confessors sensed the shift. They asked, quietly, almost casually, "You're not going to tell anyone, are you?" The listener didn't answer right away. That pause said everything. A flicker of fear crossed the confessor's face. Not fear of punishment, fear of exposure. Because once a story leaves the room, it can't be controlled. The confessor closed their eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." That sentence mattered. It acknowledged causality. And causality is the bridge between influence and responsibility. The listener leaned in. But it did. A long silence followed. When the confessor spoke again, their voice was barely audible. "I thought I was helping." That's the lie everyone tells themselves. That harm was unintended. That pressure was necessary. That outcomes were unforeseeable. But the body doesn't lie the way the mind does. And the confessor's body was shutting down under the weight of unresolved truth. In the final hours, the confession became more explicit. Names referenced. Moments clarified. Intentions explained, not excused. The listener felt physically ill. Not because of what they were hearing, but because of what it meant. This wasn't a vague admission. It was a map. And maps lead somewhere. When the end finally came, it was quiet. No dramatic final words. Just stillness. And suddenly, the listener was alone with a truth that no longer belonged to the living. Grief hid in waves. Not just for the loss of life, but for the loss of certainty. Because now the listener had to decide what came next. Honor the dead by keeping their secret, or honor the truth by letting it disrupt everything. The days after the death passed in a blur. Arrangements, condolences, public expressions of sympathy. The family leaned heavily on familiar language. Tragic, unimaginable, unfair. But the listener heard something else beneath it. Relief. Relief that the confessor could no longer speak. Relief that the truth, perhaps, had died with them. That assumption would prove dangerously wrong. Because truth doesn't need a living witness to survive. It just needs someone willing to carry it forward. And the listener was reaching the point where carrying it alone felt impossible. As we move into the next chapter, we're going to examine the moment when silence finally broke. Not publicly, not dramatically, but decisively. Because once the listener chose to act, there was no going back. And the consequences of that choice would ripple outward, into investigations, into relationships, into the very foundation of the story everyone thought they understood. What came next wouldn't just challenge who was responsible. It would challenge what justice even means when harm is shaped by words instead of weapons. There's a unique kind of tension that builds in families after a deathbed confession. Not the shock of a revelation itself. Not the grief that follows a passing, but the quiet, persistent weight of knowing someone manipulated the events that led to a tragedy, and that you are the only one who knows the full story. The listener had held the confession privately for days, then weeks. Every interaction with family members, lawyers, and investigators carried an unspoken undertone. Every casual remark became a test. Could I trust anyone with this? Should I reveal it? Or should I continue shouldering a secret that was both explosive and toxic? The first moments of external pressure arrived subtly. Media speculation was growing. Rumors started circulating online. Journalists and tabloids pieced together fragments of the public narrative, creating a distorted mosaic of blame, motive, and timing. Every leak, every detail made the listener wonder, if I remained silent, am I protecting the confessor or allowing? The listener persisted, methodically reconstructing the sequence of interactions leading to the night of the tragedy. They described the emotional pressures, the persistent suggestions disguised as advice, the way repeated subtle nudges shaped decisions over weeks, even months. They spoke of the confessor's recognition of their own influence and of the internal struggle to reconcile intention with outcome. It was overwhelming. The weight of history, of unspoken truths, now filled the room. And as the family grappled with the implications, the listener realized the confession had done more than clarify events. It had reshaped relationships. It had shifted perceptions. It had exposed the moral complexity beneath what had once seemed simple. Questions arose immediately. How much influence is too much? When does guidance become coercion? Who truly bears responsibility when actions are shaped by others? These were not rhetorical. They were urgent, pointed, and impossible to answer definitively. And then came the unexpected. The listener noticed subtle admissions from other family members, acknowledgments of their own indirect roles, the ways they had contributed to a culture of pressure, even if unintentionally. Guilt, shame, and defensive rationalizations intermingled, creating a tension so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. By the end of the session, the truth was no longer contained. It had taken on a life of its own. The confession had sparked reflection, disclosure, and confrontation. Family dynamics were irrevocably altered. Loyalties were questioned. Bonds stretched thin. But even as the shock subsided slightly, another realization struck everyone. The confession had consequences beyond the room. Memories, actions, and motivations now existed as testimony, implicit yet undeniable. Investigators, if they had access to these insights, could reinterpret events. Public narratives could shift. Media speculation could gain traction. And most unsettling of all, the listener now carried the dual responsibility of truth and discretion. They knew that sharing too widely could devastate the family further, yet withholding it could allow misperceptions to persist, potentially harming the very people they sought to protect. That night, the listener reflected on the enormity of what had just occurred. The room was quiet. The confession lingered in the air. Every movement, every glance, every unspoken thought was weighted by the knowledge that nothing would ever return to the way it had been. The story was no longer just about a tragic night. It was about moral responsibility, about influence, about the consequences of choices made in moments both subtle and deliberate. It was about how a deathbed confession, once spoken, could ripple outward, reshaping lives, relationships, and perceptions forever. And as sleep finally claimed the listener, the shadow of what had been revealed loomed large. Questions remained unanswered. Reactions remained unresolved. The path forward was uncertain, precarious, and fraught with emotional complexity. But one thing was clear: the confession would not be forgotten. It had broken free from silence. And once that happens, nothing is ever the same. Once a confession leaves the safety of a private room, it begins to move in ways no one can fully predict. In the days following the disclosure, the listener noticed subtle shifts in behavior across the family. Some members became distant, retreating into routines and distractions. Others became hypervigilant, monitoring conversations for anything that might hint at more undisclosed truths. Tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like smoke that refuses to clear. At first, the reactions were subtle. A glance lingered a second too long. A comment was met with hesitation. Emails and messages were written with extreme care. The confession had acted as a lens, refracting old interactions into new meanings. Every prior discussion, every moment of pressure, guidance, or subtle suggestion was now viewed through the prism of influence and moral responsibility. Questions erupted, not always spoken aloud. Did we notice before? Did we participate indirectly? Could we have intervened? Each family member wrestled privately with these uncertainties, and the weight of shared responsibility began to fracture unity. Meanwhile, the listener remained the quiet anchor, the one who held the full account of the deathbed confession. But even this role became increasingly fraught. Holding the truth in isolation felt unbearable. It was like balancing a live wire. One wrong move, one careless word, and the fragile equilibrium could shatter entirely. One evening, a particularly charged exchange occurred. Two siblings argued over how to address the growing tension publicly. One insisted that silence was protection. The other, vaguely aware of what the listener had shared, argued that truth could no longer be contained. Tempers flared, voices rose, and years of accumulated grievances spilled into the open. The listener remained silent, observing, recording, knowing that the emotional turbulence would only escalate as long as the truth was in their hands. This chapter explores how a single confession, carefully held and selectively disclosed, can ripple outward like a stone thrown into a still pond. The waves reach every shore. Trust is eroded, loyalties are tested, and the perception of reality begins to fragment. The public narrative remained incomplete, even as private understanding deepened. Media reports continued to frame the events as the actions of the son alone, while inside the family, everyone grappled with the knowledge that influence and emotional pressure had played a significant role. This disconnect created an invisible tension, a dissonance between what outsiders believed and what insiders knew. At this point, the listener faced a moral dilemma. Should they continue to carry the full truth, or should fragments be shared more widely to prevent misinterpretation? Every choice had consequences, every disclosure risked new conflicts, and yet remaining silent was increasingly impossible. Then came the turning point. An unguarded conversation, overheard by another family member, hinted that the listener might have information not yet disclosed. That quiet observation, a mere sentence, accelerated the inevitable. Rumors of hidden knowledge began circulating internally, further destabilizing trust. In parallel, the listener realized that the confession had revealed more than just influence. It had illuminated patterns of behavior, motivations, and vulnerabilities. Recognizing these patterns allowed the listener to anticipate reactions, predict arguments, and prepare for the inevitable confrontations that lay ahead. But awareness alone could not prevent emotional fallout. It could only help navigate it. As days turned into weeks, the ripples extended outward. The family began to fracture along subtle lines. Some members aligned with the listener, seeking clarity and understanding. Others recoiled, defensive and unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths. Conversations that were once routine became strategic, each statement measured, each gesture carefully calculated. Even small interactions were charged with meaning. A casual comment at dinner could be interpreted as judgment. A text message could be scrutinized for hidden intent. The confession had changed the emotional gravity of every interaction, reshaping relationships at their core. Yet the listener pressed on, documenting everything meticulously. Dates, phrases, tone, every detail mattered. Memory alone was unreliable, and the record they maintained became a tether to truth in a family increasingly adrift in suspicion and misperception. As the chapter closes, the tension reaches a new peak. The listener understands that the confession cannot remain confined. Its influence is spreading, inevitably touching every relationship, every decision, every perception. The question now is not if the truth will be fully revealed, but how, and what the consequences will be when it finally is. The confession had set off a chain reaction that no one could fully control. Each family member began processing it in their own way, and the results were unpredictable, volatile, and often contradictory. Some reacted with denial, some with guilt, and some with calculated restraint. The house, once a place of routine and relative calm, became a minefield of unspoken accusations and fragile alliances. It started with small confrontations. A sibling would casually reference past events, testing how much the listener knew. Another would bring up decisions made in hindsight, gauging the listener's reaction. Every comment, every question, every hesitation carried weight far beyond the words themselves. The confession had changed the rules of engagement, and everyone now played differently. Alliances began forming quietly, subtly. Certain family members gravitated toward each other, sharing private whispers, validating suspicions, or reinforcing narratives that protected themselves. Others kept their distance, wary of being drawn into debates they could not control. The listener became a pivot point, the center of gravity around which these alliances revolved, and the burden of knowledge made every interaction tense and deliberate. One particularly charged exchange occurred late in the evening. The listener was approached by a family member who had previously seemed indifferent, who now asked pointedly, "Do you really understand the consequences of what was said? And what's left unsaid?" The question was loaded with suspicion, fear, and implicit accusation. It forced the listener to weigh every word, every fragment of the confession and every potential outcome before responding. Meanwhile, subtle signs emerged that some family members were beginning to suspect more than they let on. An overlooked phrase, a fleeting look, a sudden withdrawal. These micro-moments hinted at understanding without outright acknowledgement. The confession, though privately held, was now shaping behavior across the family. People began to self-censor, to monitor themselves and each other, to navigate a delicate balance of honesty, protection, and denial. The listener noticed patterns emerging. Certain individuals seemed to downplay the significance of the confession, while others amplified it quietly, hinting at their own awareness. Emotional responses varied wildly. From cold, calculated neutrality to raw, uncontrolled bursts of grief and anger. The confession had acted as a catalyst, revealing fissures in family dynamics that had existed but remained hidden until now. In one intense encounter, a heated discussion erupted over the son's past actions. The confessor's influence, once invisible, was now a central point of debate. Who bore responsibility? To what extent was influence the same as direct action? The arguments were fractured, uncoordinated, yet each carried an implicit acknowledgement of the confession. The listener observed, documenting, silently measuring the implications for both personal relationships and the broader narrative. As the chapter progressed, it became clear that the confession was reshaping priorities. Some family members began reevaluating past decisions, questioning long-held assumptions, and reconsidering alliances. Emotional loyalty was tested, often pitting siblings against each other, parent against child, relative against relative. Trust, once taken for granted, had to be earned and re-earned in every conversation, every gesture, every silence. The tension culminated in a pivotal private confrontation. The listener, faced with a direct question about their knowledge of the confession, chose to reveal carefully calibrated portions of the truth. The impact was immediate. Shock, disbelief, and fear rippled through the room. Unspoken guilt and defensive rationalizations surfaced. For the first time, several family members recognized that the confession altered their understanding of past events, and that their own roles, however indirect, had consequences. This confrontation was only the beginning. It set the stage for broader disclosures, strategic decisions, and the inevitable ripple effects that would touch relationships, reputations, and internal power structures. The listener, now fully aware of the responsibility of holding and revealing the confession, faced a new dilemma: how to manage the truth in a way that would prevent further harm while ensuring accountability. As this chapter closes, the family is in flux. Old loyalties are questioned, new alliances are tentative, and the weight of the confession hangs over every interaction. No one knows how far the truth should travel or who will ultimately bear its impact. And the most chilling realization remains. Once a deathbed confession enters the world, its influence cannot be contained. It moves quietly but inexorably, reshaping lives in ways that are impossible to predict. Once a truth of that magnitude begins to circulate, it behaves like a force of nature. It pushes, it pulls, it changes trajectories, and there is no turning it back. The deathbed confession, once revealed selectively within the family, began generating consequences that extended far beyond what anyone anticipated. The first domino fell quietly. A minor disagreement about finances suddenly escalated. One sibling referenced a past decision, innocuous at the time, now reframed under the lens of influence and pressure. Accusations, subtle yet pointed, slipped into conversation. "Remember how you handled that situation?" one asked. "Do you think that was really fair?" The listener, aware of the confession's implications, remained composed, documenting yet carefully navigating the fragile atmosphere. Emotional tension intensified as the confession forced everyone to examine their own complicity. Some family members began to feel guilt for not recognizing the patterns sooner. Others bristled, defensive and unwilling to entertain the idea that influence might have shaped critical decisions. The family dynamic, already strained, became a delicate dance of assertion and denial, with the listener at the center, holding the linchpin truth. Small interactions became testing grounds. A shared meal could spark subtle confrontations. Casual remarks about responsibility were now fraught with subtext. A glance could communicate suspicion. Silence itself became loaded, weighted with questions no one dared ask aloud. The confession had transformed the ordinary rhythms of family life into a web of observation and reaction, each member acutely aware that every move could reveal hidden truths. Meanwhile, the listener observed a disturbing pattern. Some members began forming quiet alliances, sharing suspicions and strategizing, not openly, but through subtle communications. Certain individuals sought validation from the listener, attempting to gauge how much was known and how much influence had truly been exerted. Others distanced themselves, fearful that any association with the confession could implicate them morally, if not legally. The tension reached a critical point when a family meeting was convened under the guise of discussion about practical matters, estates, logistics, and future planning. Beneath the surface, however, it was a minefield of emotions and unspoken knowledge. Every statement, every question, every reaction became a potential trigger. The listener, holding the full confession, navigated the room with extreme care, aware that any slip could shatter the fragile equilibrium. During the meeting, one sibling indirectly referenced the confession, speaking in hypotheticals. Sometimes people push others too far without realizing it, they said. The statement caused a ripple of subtle shifts, nods, tight smiles, quick glances exchanged. The listener recognized this as the first clear sign that the confession's knowledge had permeated beyond the immediate disclosure. It was no longer just a private truth. It had begun shaping perceptions, behaviors, and alliances. This realization introduced a new layer of responsibility. The listener now understood that the confession's reverberations were creating moral and emotional consequences that could not be contained. Each family member's interpretation of past events was shifting, subtly realigning loyalties and resentments. Old grievances resurfaced, reframed in the light of influence and moral accountability. The domino effect accelerated. Arguments that would have once dissipated quickly now lingered, fueled by the awareness of the confession. Minor disputes became symbolic battlegrounds over responsibility, guilt, and memory. Trust, once assumed, was now conditional, contingent on perceived alignment with the revealed truth. Every interaction carried hidden calculations, as family members adjusted behavior to protect themselves, their image, or their version of events. The listener, aware of their central role, faced an unrelenting psychological burden. Every decision about disclosure, every fragment of the confession revealed or withheld, had consequences. The weight of responsibility, already immense, now included the unpredictable ways the confession would influence emotions, relationships, and narratives. The line between moral duty and self-preservation blurred, forcing the listener to constantly evaluate how far to let the truth travel. By the chapter's end, the family was in a state of delicate instability. Small actions could trigger major emotional reactions. The listener realized that the confession's influence had created a new reality, one where every choice carried amplified significance. Patterns of loyalty, guilt, and suspicion had shifted permanently, and there was no going back to the old equilibrium. The final thought lingering as the chapter closes. Once a confession like this enters a family's consciousness, it sets forces in motion that cannot be reversed. Each ripple carries potential consequences, and the next move, by any family member, could escalate the situation beyond control. The confession had done more than just illuminate past influence. It had fractured trust in ways that would be impossible to fully repair. The family, already strained by grief and the aftermath of the tragedy, now faced the subtle, insidious effects of knowledge. Every interaction was shadowed by the awareness of unspoken truths and hidden pressures. In the days that followed, the listener noticed a marked change in behavior among certain family members. Conversations were measured, carefully phrased to avoid triggering suspicion or defensiveness. Some members became unusually cooperative, eager to demonstrate alignment with what they assumed the listener knew. Others withdrew, refusing to engage, creating an invisible barrier that made even casual interactions tense and unpredictable. The first overt confrontation came in the form of a quiet accusation. One sibling, sensing that the listener had information beyond what was publicly known, pressed indirectly. You seem to understand more than we do. Are you keeping things from us? The room thickened with tension. The listener, aware of the full confession, responded carefully, offering neither confirmation nor denial. Yet the weight of presence made the impact unmistakable. The silence that followed was suffocating. Simultaneously, alliances within the family began to shift. Subtle cues, shared glances, hushed comments, and selective collaboration revealed a recalibration of trust. Those who aligned with the listener gained a sense of insider knowledge and, with it, power. Those who resisted, fearing moral exposure or guilt, grew defensive, sometimes aggressively so. It became a psychological battlefield where every action, word,